There's a moment, and most people never catch it, when a conversation stops being just a conversation. No one plans it. No one decides it. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't start with a secret. It doesn't start with a lie. It starts with something far more ordinary. A message at 11 p.m. A joke that only two people would understand. A moment where someone feels seen, really seen, by someone who isn't their partner. And by the time either person realizes what's happening, something has already shifted. This is the psychology of emotional affairs. And the most unsettling truth about them is this: they almost never feel like an affair when they're beginning. We live in an era of constant connection. We talk to people all day: coworkers, friends, acquaintances, through screens, through offices, through shared spaces. And most of those conversations stay exactly what they appear to be: harmless, surface level, forgettable. But sometimes one of those connections doesn't stay surface level. Psychologists define an emotional affair as an intimate emotional connection with someone outside your primary relationship, one that begins to meet needs your partner should be meeting. Needs for understanding, for excitement, for feeling valued. Here's what's important to understand. The people involved almost never set out to create this. There's no decision point. There's no moment where someone says, I'm going to emotionally invest in this person outside my relationship. It happens gradually. So gradually, in fact, that both people can be deep inside it before either one names it for what it is. And that's the part that catches people off guard. Because when you're inside it, it doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like friendship. It feels like connection. It feels like two people who simply understand each other. The brain doesn't hand you a warning label. It just hands you dopamine. Let's walk through how this actually unfolds. Not in dramatic, cinematic terms, but in the quiet, realistic way it happens in real life. It usually starts in a completely unremarkable setting. An office, a group chat, a fitness class, a parents' group. Somewhere two people keep appearing in the same space, having the same small interactions over time. And in the beginning, those interactions are genuinely innocent. Small talk about work, a shared opinion about something trivial, a moment of mutual frustration about the same thing. But then this is the first subtle shift. One of those conversations goes a little deeper than usual. Maybe someone mentions they've had a rough week. Maybe the other person responds with more genuine empathy than expected. Maybe there's a moment of real honesty that wasn't planned. And that moment leaves a small impression. Neither person thinks much of it, but the brain notices. It files it away. It associates that person with the feeling of being understood. And the next time they cross paths, there's a slightly warmer quality to the interaction, a slightly faster response to the message, a slightly longer conversation than the one before. This is stage one, and it's so mild, so natural feeling that it bypasses almost every conscious filter we have. Then comes stage two. The conversations start becoming slightly more personal, not dramatically, but incrementally. Instead of talking about work, they're talking about their frustrations with work. Instead of talking about the weekend, they're talking about what they actually want their life to look like. And somewhere in here, something important happens. They start sharing things they haven't been sharing at home. Not because they've decided to confide in this person, but because this person asks, or listens differently, or doesn't immediately pivot the conversation back to themselves, or responds without judgment. The emotional rewards are subtle but consistent, and the brain responds to consistent rewards. Every time. Stage three is where protective walls start quietly lowering. Inside jokes start forming. Little references only the two of them would catch. A shared language that isn't accessible to anyone else. And with that shared language comes a sense of us, a micro-identity that exists only in the context of this specific connection. This is when comparison begins. Not always consciously, not always cruelly, but it begins. This person listens to me so easily. Why does it feel so effortful at home lately? This person gets excited about the same things I care about. When did my partner stop being curious about my thoughts? And those comparisons, as unfair as they are, because they're comparing a curated, pressure-free interaction to a full, complicated relationship, begin to tilt emotional investment. Now we arrive at the turning point. The moment that, in hindsight, is often where people say that's when things changed. It's the moment when the outside connection becomes the first place someone takes their emotional news. Something good happens, they think of this person before they think of their partner. Something difficult happens, they draft the message to this person before they've processed it with their partner. This is the tipping point, not the flirtation, not the late night conversations. The shift in emotional priority is where an emotional affair quietly crosses from close friendship into something that begins pulling at the foundation of the primary relationship. Because relationships are built on emotional intimacy. They're sustained by the consistent sharing of your inner world, your hopes, your fears, your daily frustrations, your small victories. When that sharing starts flowing in a different direction toward a different person, the relationship at home slowly loses something it may not even notice it's losing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The way a slow leak empties something over time. The partner at home often senses something is off before they can name it. There's a slight distance they can't explain, a distraction, a phone that's picked up too quickly, an energy that seems slightly elsewhere. But when they ask, the answer is nothing's wrong, and the person saying it genuinely believes that, because in their mind, nothing has happened, nothing physical, nothing dramatic, nothing they can point to. And yet everything is already beginning to reorganize around this new emotional center. So why does this happen? What is the psychology beneath this pattern? The answer lies in something fundamental about how human beings are wired, and it has very little to do with character flaws or moral weakness. Long-term relationships follow a neurological arc. In the early stages, a relationship is bathed in novelty, and novelty triggers the brain's reward system with remarkable intensity. Dopamine floods, serotonin rises. Everything about the other person feels magnetic, interesting, worthy of sustained attention. But the brain cannot maintain that level of stimulation indefinitely. It wasn't designed to. Over time, as a relationship becomes stable and familiar, the novelty response naturally quiets. This is not a failure of love. This is neuroscience. The brain adapts to what is consistent. The problem is that we often mistake that neurological adaptation for emotional disconnection. The relationship feels less exciting, and we interpret that as something being wrong rather than understanding that the shift from passionate novelty to deep, stable attachment is actually the destination of a healthy relationship, not the symptom of a failing one. But here's where it gets complicated. When a new person enters our lives, someone who represents novelty, someone whose attention we haven't yet earned, someone who doesn't yet know our habits and flaws, the brain responds to them with a refreshed reward response. Not because they are more deserving of our emotional energy, but because they are new. And the brain responds to new. This is not a character indictment. This is a neurological reality that every long-term relationship must reckon with. The emotional affair happens in the space between what we understand intellectually and what we feel chemically. We know our partner is the person we've chosen. We know this new connection is built on incomplete information, on the curated, conflict-free, low-stakes version of someone. And yet the feelings generated by that new connection feel more vivid, more alive, in a way that can be profoundly disorienting. Psychologists also point to something called emotional mirroring, the deep human need to feel that another person genuinely reflects back who we are. When we feel unseen in our primary relationship and in long-term relationships, familiarity can sometimes breed a certain kind of emotional shorthand that actually diminishes genuine curiosity. We become particularly vulnerable to anyone who offers that reflection. The outside person becomes a mirror, and in that mirror we often see a version of ourselves we've missed. This isn't a rare phenomenon. It isn't a story about weak people or broken relationships. It is a deeply human pattern, one that plays out across cultures, across demographics, across relationship types. Research consistently shows that emotional affairs are far more common than physical ones. And in many ways, they are more destabilizing precisely because they're harder to detect, harder to confront, and harder to categorize. There's also a modern dimension to this that previous generations didn't navigate with the same intensity. Technology has removed almost every natural barrier to this kind of connection. A conversation that would once have required physical proximity can now happen at midnight, in bed, with someone thousands of miles away. The psychological intimacy can deepen without any of the friction that once naturally slowed these connections down. We carry everyone we know in our pockets, and that proximity, that constant, frictionless availability changes the emotional landscape in ways we're still only beginning to understand. There's also the role of validation psychology. Human beings have an almost biological drive toward feeling valued. We need to feel that who we are matters to someone, somewhere. In the early stages of a romantic relationship, that validation comes in concentrated, powerful doses. Over time, as the relationship matures and both partners stop performing as intensely for each other, the relationship becomes less intense. That validation becomes quieter, more assumed, less frequent. And into that space of slightly reduced attention, slightly lower emotional voltage, new connections insert themselves. Not maliciously, not predatorily, often simply because two people found each other interesting. And interesting, when we're running low on feeling truly interesting to the person who matters most to us, is an extraordinarily powerful thing. The emotional affair doesn't thrive because of what's present in the outside connection. It thrives because of what's been allowed to go quiet in the primary one. Here's why this matters, not as a warning, not as an accusation, but as a quiet invitation to reflect. Most people believe they would recognize if something was drifting emotionally. Most people believe they would know if they were becoming too close to someone outside their relationship. Most people believe the line is clear. But the research and the pattern of human behavior tells a different story. The line is not clear. It is gradual. It is paved with moments that each, individually, felt entirely harmless. And it is navigated most dangerously not by reckless people, but by people who are emotionally hungry and not yet honest with themselves about what they're reaching for. The question isn't always, are you having an emotional affair? The more uncomfortable question and the more useful one is there something I've stopped bringing to my relationship that I've started bringing somewhere else? Because emotional affairs don't begin with the decision to stray. They begin with a decision to stop tending to something at home, combined with the gradual comfort of someone who asks fewer questions, carries less history, and offers the clean, uncomplicated pleasure of being known without being truly known. They begin in the gap between what we're not saying to our partners and what we start saying to someone else. And the most consistent thing research tells us about them is this: by the time most people acknowledge what's happening, the emotional transfer has already been underway for longer than they want to admit. Not because they're dishonest people, but because it is profoundly uncomfortable to name something that feels good as something that might be causing harm. Before this ends, sit with two questions, not to create guilt, not to provoke anxiety, but because these are the questions that, if answered honestly, tell you more about the current state of a relationship than almost anything else. When was the last time you brought your most vulnerable, unguarded emotional truth to your partner, not to vent, not to process out loud, but to genuinely connect? And is there someone in your life right now who knows things about your inner world that your partner doesn't? Not because knowing the answer changes everything immediately, but because the gap between those two answers, that gap is where emotional affairs live. That gap is what feeds them. And that gap, when recognized early enough, is also what can be closed. Emotional affairs don't end relationships in a single dramatic moment. They dismantle them slowly, one honest conversation redirected, one moment of vulnerability shared with the wrong person, one small withdrawal from the relationship that never quite gets replenished. The people involved are rarely villains. They're usually just people who stopped choosing their relationship with the same intentionality they once brought to it and found. In the absence of that intention, that emotional connection will always find somewhere to go. That's the quiet, uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. Love is not passive. Connection is not self-sustaining. The relationships we want are not destinations we arrive at and then stop navigating. They require the same curiosity, the same attention, the same willingness to be known that drew two people together in the first place. And when we stop offering that to each other, when we let familiarity become the place where curiosity goes to be replaced by assumption, we leave a door open. Not necessarily to anyone in particular, but open. And open doors in a world of constant connection are rarely empty for long.